The autumn sun cast long shadows across Clara Thompson's front porch in the quiet neighborhood of Maple Grove. At 72, she sat in her weathered rocking chair, a fixture she'd maintained through decades of watching her community change. The house, a modest two-story colonial she'd purchased with her late husband James in 1975, stood as one of the first black-owned properties in what was once an exclusively white neighborhood. Clara adjusted her reading glasses, setting aside the worn photo album on her lap. The images inside captured moments from the civil rights movement, herself as a young woman at sit-ins, James speaking at community meetings, and their shared commitment to peaceful resistance. Her arthritis-stiffened fingers traced the edge of a particularly meaningful photograph from 1968, showing her standing proudly outside the newly integrated local high school where she would teach for 30 years. The peaceful evening shattered when Officer Mike Davidson's patrol car crawled past her house for the third time that day. Clara had noticed his increased presence in the neighborhood over the past few months, especially after several wealthy white families moved into the newly developed section of Maple Grove. Davidson parked his vehicle at an angle across her driveway, a deliberate act of intimidation she'd seen him employ before. The officer emerged from his car, adjusting his belt with exaggerated authority. "Mrs. Thompson," he called out, his voice carrying a false sweetness that barely masked his contempt. "We've received complaints about suspicious activity in this area." Clara remained seated, her posture straight despite her years. "Officer Davidson, this is my property. I've lived here for 47 years. Davidson mounted the porch steps, his boots heavy against the wooden boards. "Times change, ma'am. This neighborhood's getting an upgrade, if you know what I mean. Folks are concerned about their property values." "I know exactly what you mean," Clara responded, her voice steady. "And I'm not going anywhere." The confrontation escalated when Davidson moved closer, deliberately knocking over her side table. Clara's photo album crashed to the floor, pages scattering. When she stood to retrieve her memories, Davidson blocked her path. Resisting an officer's instructions, he sneered, reaching for her arm. "Don't touch me," Clara warned, attempting to step around him. Davidson's response was swift and violent. He shoved her backward, causing her to lose balance. Clara's head struck the porch railing as she fell. The impact sent a sharp pain through her skull, and her vision blurred. Her cry of pain echoed down the street, piercing the evening quiet. Lights flicked on in neighboring houses. Mrs. Chen from next door appeared on her lawn, phone already recording. Other neighbors emerged, drawn by Clara's scream. Davidson backed away, suddenly aware of the witnesses, but maintained his authoritative stance. She became combative, he announced to the gathering crowd, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Clara lay on her side, conscious but dazed, blood trickling from a cut above her temple. The familiar faces of her neighbors swam in her vision as they rushed to help. Through the pain and confusion, one thought remained clear: this was not 1965, and she would not be silenced by fear again. This incident would soon ripple through the community, but in that moment, Clara focused on breathing through the pain, knowing her son Anthony would soon hear about what happened. The thought of her boy, now the police chief, gave her strength, even as darkness edged her vision. Anthony Thompson sat at the head of the conference table in the Maple Grove Police Department, reviewing crime statistics with his command staff when his phone vibrated. The text from Mrs. Chen, his mother's neighbor, made his blood run cold. "Your mother's been attacked by an officer. She's being taken to Memorial Hospital." He stood abruptly, cutting off Lieutenant Santos mid-sentence. The room fell silent as their usually composed chief struggled to maintain his professional demeanor. Meeting adjourned. "Rodriguez, you're in charge until I return." In his 23 years of law enforcement, Anthony had learned to compartmentalize his emotions, but this was different. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he navigated through evening traffic, emergency lights flashing. The journey to Memorial Hospital felt endless, his mind racing through scenarios, each worse than the last. The emergency room buzzed with activity when he arrived. His mother lay on a bed in Bay 3, medical staff hovering around her. Clara's face was swollen on one side, a butterfly bandage covering the cut on her temple. Her clothes were disheveled, and her favorite cardigan was torn at the sleeve. "Mom," Anthony called softly, approaching the bed. The sight of her injuries made his jaw clench. As both a son and a law enforcement officer, he felt the weight of this moment crushing down on him. Clara turned toward his voice, her eyes clear despite the pain. "Anthony, don't you dare blame yourself for this," she said firmly, reading the guilt on his face. A nurse paused in taking vitals to give them space. "Who did this?" Anthony asked, though he already suspected. He'd received complaints about Davidson before, but nothing concrete enough to warrant serious action. Now, looking at his mother's injuries, he cursed his previous hesitation. "Mike Davidson," Clara confirmed, wincing as the doctor examined her head. "But this isn't just about me, Anthony. This has been building for months. He's been harassing others too, they're just too afraid to speak up." The doctor interrupted, explaining Clara had a mild concussion and would need monitoring. Anthony listened, taking mental notes, his police training kicking in despite his personal involvement. "Chief Thompson," the doctor added, "given the circumstances, we're documenting everything thoroughly for potential legal proceedings." Clara reached for Anthony's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Son, you wear that badge for a reason. Remember what your father used to say. Change comes from within the system, but only if good people are willing to risk everything for what's right." Anthony felt torn between his roles, the dutiful son who wanted revenge and the police chief sworn to uphold the law impartially. His mother's eyes held his, and he saw in them the same determination that had carried her through decades of civil rights activism. "This isn't just about getting justice for me," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength. "It's about every person who's ever been afraid to walk their own streets, every citizen who's lost faith in those sworn to protect them. You're in a position to make real change, Anthony. Don't waste this opportunity." The weight of her words settled over him. Clara had always been more than just his mother, she was a pillar of strength, a voice for justice, and now, unwillingly but unflinchingly, a symbol of the very problems he'd promised to address when he became chief. "I won't let this stand," Anthony promised, careful to keep his voice low. "But I need you to fight too, Mom. We do this right, by the book, so it sticks." Clara nodded, then grimaced at the movement. "I've been fighting my whole life, baby. I'm not about to stop now." The evening after Clara's attack, over 200 people gathered outside her home, holding candles that dotted the darkening street like earthbound stars. The crowd was diverse, long-time residents who remembered the neighborhood's segregated past, young families who'd moved in during recent years, and students from the local college where Clara had once taught. News of the assault spread rapidly through social media and community networks. What started as a spontaneous gathering of concerned neighbors evolved into an organized vigil, complete with printed signs reading, "Justice for Clara," and "No Place for Hate in Maple Grove." Sarah Jenkins, a young community organizer, coordinated with local churches to provide chairs for elderly attendees and set up a small sound system. The atmosphere was solemn but charged with purpose. Reporters from local stations positioned their cameras at strategic points, their presence ensuring this wouldn't be dismissed as just another neighborhood incident. Through the crowd, a striking figure made her way forward, Denise Washington, Clara's friend of 50 years and fellow civil rights activist. At 75, she moved slowly but purposefully, her white hair a beacon in the crowd. The murmuring crowd parted to let her through. "I've known Clara Thompson since we were young women sitting at segregated lunch counters," Denise's voice carried across the gathering without need for amplification. "We've seen this before, authority used as a weapon, badges used as shields for bigotry. But let me tell you something about Clara, and about us." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd, particularly the younger faces. "We didn't march, sit in, and risk our lives in the 60s so our children could face the same hatred in 2024. When they attacked us then, we got stronger. When they tried to silence us, we got louder. And when they pushed us down, we got back up, together." From his position at the edge of the crowd, Anthony watched the scene unfold. He stood in civilian clothes, deliberately keeping a low profile. His presence was both professional and deeply personal, monitoring the gathering while being moved by the outpouring of support for his mother. Several of his officers patrolled the periphery, their faces revealing mixed emotions. Some showed genuine concern, others discomfort. Anthony noted who displayed what reaction, mentally mapping the landscape of loyalty and resistance within his department. Denise continued speaking, her words bridging generations. "To the young people here tonight, this is your moment. Your generation has tools we never had. Use them. Record everything. Share your stories. Don't let them pretend this isn't happening." The crowd responded with raised phones, their lights joining the candles. Social media feeds were already flooding with images and videos of the vigil, spreading the story far beyond Maple Grove. A young black woman stepped forward, introducing herself as a current student at the high school where Clara had taught. "Mrs. Thompson taught my mother," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "She showed us that education is power, that our voices matter. Now it's our turn to stand up for her." Anthony felt the weight of his badge in his pocket. The gathering represented everything he'd sworn to protect: the right to peaceful assembly, the power of community, the demand for justice. Yet it also highlighted the deep divide between law enforcement and the people they served, a divide he now had to bridge while investigating one of his own. As the vigil continued into the night, the mood shifted from mourning to mobilization. People exchanged contact information, formed committees, and planned future actions. What started as a response to violence was transforming into a movement for change. From her window, Clara watched it all, her bandaged head held high. The sight of her community united in support gave her strength, even as she understood that the road ahead would be challenging. This wasn't just about one incident or one officer anymore, it had become something much larger, a catalyst for confronting long-ignored issues in Maple Grove. In his office early the next morning, Anthony began the painstaking process of investigating Mike Davidson's history. His desk was covered with personnel files, incident reports, and civilian complaints spanning Davidson's 15 years on the force. The pattern emerging from these documents made his stomach turn. The official complaints were just the tip of the iceberg: 3 excessive force allegations, all involving minorities, all dismissed due to insufficient evidence. But it was the unofficial records that told the real story. Multiple warnings from previous supervisors, notes about aggressive demeanor during routine stops, and a concerning number of confrontations that never made it to formal reports. Anthony pulled up Davidson's body camera footage from recent months, noting how often it was conveniently turned off during crucial moments. He cross-referenced patrol schedules with reported incidents, revealing that complaints about police harassment spiked during Davidson's shifts in predominantly minority neighborhoods. A knock on his door interrupted his research. Lieutenant Garcia, his most trusted officer, entered with a concerned expression. "Chief, word's getting around about what you're doing," the union rep called. "They're saying you're too personally involved to handle this investigation." "What's the unofficial word, Maria?" Anthony asked, knowing Garcia had her finger on the department's pulse. She closed the door before speaking. "It's bad. Davidson's got friends in high places. Remember that poker game group he's part of? Turns out the deputy commissioner's been a regular for years. They're circling the wagons." Anthony nodded, having expected this. He pulled up an email from Internal Affairs on his computer screen. "Look at this. 3 previous investigations into Davidson were mysteriously closed without conclusion. The investigating officers were all transferred or promoted shortly after. They're already preparing their defense," Garcia warned. "I overheard Matthews and Sullivan in the break room. They're pushing the narrative that your mother was combative, that Davidson was following protocol." The betrayal stung, but didn't surprise him. Matthews and Sullivan were part of the old guard, officers who'd served with Davidson for years. Their loyalty was to the Brotherhood, not justice. Anthony spent the next hours interviewing officers who'd partnered with Davidson. Most gave carefully worded responses, clearly afraid of retaliation. But a few rookie officers, still idealistic enough to believe in the system, shared disturbing stories. Davidson had warned them about problem neighborhoods and troublemakers, code words that carried clear racial implications. By afternoon, the pressure mounted. Anonymous messages appeared in his inbox, some threatening, others pleading him to think about your career. The thin blue line was turning into a noose, tightening around anyone who dared question one of their own. A call from the police union lawyer made their position clear. "Chief Thompson, we understand this is personal for you, but pursuing this could damage department morale. Perhaps it's best to handle this internally, quietly." The implied threat was clear: back off or face consequences. Anthony looked at the photo on his desk, showing him and his mother at his police academy graduation. She'd been so proud that day, believing her son could change the system from within. Now, surrounded by evidence of corruption and facing resistance from his own officers, Anthony realized the true scope of what he was up against. This wasn't just about one bad officer, it was about a culture of protection that had allowed people like Davidson to operate with impunity for years. He began documenting everything, making copies, securing evidence. If they wanted a fight, he'd give them one. But he'd do it by the book, building a case so solid that not even the old boys network could tear it down. Clara's living room had transformed into an unexpected command center for community activism. Despite her injury still healing, she hosted daily meetings with people sharing their experiences of discrimination. What started as informal gatherings evolved into structured support sessions, drawing participants from across the city. "They pulled my son over 3 times in 1 week," shared Mrs. Rodriguez, a middle-aged Latino woman, her voice trembling. "Each time, Officer Davidson was involved. My boy's only 16, just got his license. Now he's afraid to drive." Clara documented every story meticulously in a leather-bound notebook, her teacher's habits serving a new purpose. Names, dates, locations, patterns emerged from these personal accounts. Young men targeted repeatedly, elderly residents intimidated during routine calls, families feeling unsafe in their own neighborhoods. The younger generation brought their technical expertise. Jasmine, a college student majoring in digital media, helped create a secure online platform where people could safely share their experiences. "We need to show this isn't isolated," she explained while setting up the website. "Each story strengthens our case." Clara's approach bridged generations. She shared her civil rights-era experiences with young activists, while they taught her about hashtag campaigns and viral messaging. Hashtag Justice for Clara trended locally, then regionally. Social media amplified what traditional channels might have ignored. In 1965, we had to rely on word of mouth and underground newspapers, Clara told a group of high school students visiting her home. "You have tools we couldn't imagine. Use them wisely. Document everything. Your phones are weapons of truth." The movement grew beyond just police accountability. Clara's story sparked discussions about systemic racism, institutional power, and community oversight. Local professors offered historical context. Civil rights lawyers provided pro bono consultations. Each meeting added new layers to what had started as a response to one incident. Meanwhile, Anthony's wife Sarah paced their kitchen late one night, anxiety evident in her movements. "They're watching our house," she reported, pulling back the curtain slightly. "That unmarked car's been there for hours." The pressure on Anthony's family mounted daily. Their children faced whispered comments at school. Anonymous calls disrupted their nights. Sarah found her tire slashed in the grocery store parking lot, a warning, they assumed. "Maybe we should step back," Sarah suggested, "not for the first time. Think about the kids, Anthony. Your mother would understand." But Clara had already addressed this during a private family dinner. "Fear is their weapon," she'd told them, her voice firm despite her still visible bruises. "They used it in the 60s, they're using it now. We didn't break then, we won't break now." The support group expanded to twice-weekly meetings. Clara ensured each session balanced sharing painful experiences with planning constructive actions. They organized voter registration drives, created Know Your Rights workshops, and developed an emergency response network for documenting police interactions. Local media initially portrayed the gatherings as angry protests, but Clara's measured approach and educators' dignity shaped a different narrative. She gave interviews emphasizing community healing over retribution, justice over revenge. Her message resonated beyond Maple Grove, drawing support from neighboring cities. "This isn't just about one incident or one officer," she explained to a journalist. "It's about building a community where everyone feels safe, where law enforcement serves all citizens equally. We're not fighting against the police, we're fighting for accountability." As her movement gained momentum, Clara noticed increased surveillance around her home. But for every patrol car that slowly drove by, 3 community members appeared to stand watch. The network of protection grew organically, proving that her lifetime of building relationships had created a shield stronger than intimidation. Anthony sat in his home office at midnight, surrounded by evidence he'd carefully gathered over weeks. On his laptop screen, dashcam footage played silently, Davidson's latest traffic stops showing a clear pattern of racial profiling. Stacks of civilian complaints, witness statements, and internal memos covered his desk, each piece adding to a disturbing puzzle. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A junior officer named Rodriguez had slipped an envelope under his door containing text messages between Davidson and other officers. The messages revealed not just individual bias, but a coordinated effort to target specific neighborhoods and cover up excessive force incidents. "They have a system," Rodriguez had written in an attached note. "They warn each other about body cameras, coordinate stories after incidents, and pressure witnesses to change statements." Davidson's just the visible part. The evidence pointed to a network of at least 6 officers who routinely protected each other's misconduct. More disturbing were the messages mentioning friends upstairs, suggesting corruption reached into the department's highest ranks. Anthony discovered that internal affairs investigations were consistently redirected or buried. Officers who cooperated with investigations found themselves assigned to dangerous areas without backup. Those who played along received choice assignments and overlooked infractions. His phone buzzed, a text from Deputy Commissioner Wells: "Need to discuss the Davidson situation. Breakfast tomorrow." Anthony recognized it for what it was, an attempt to offer him a way out, probably a promotion or transfer in exchange for dropping the investigation. Sarah entered the office quietly, placing a cup of coffee beside him. "The kids are asking questions," she said softly. "Tommy's friend told him his dad says you're a traitor to the badge." Anthony rubbed his tired eyes. "What did Tommy say?" "He said his grandmother taught him that doing the right thing isn't always popular." Sarah smiled slightly. "Your mother's influence runs deep." The decision crystallized in that moment. Anthony began preparing a comprehensive report, documenting every instance of misconduct, every covered-up complaint, every corrupted investigation. He included the text messages, body camera footage, and testimony from officers like Rodriguez who'd risked their careers to speak up. But he knew submitting this through official channels would bury it. The network was too entrenched, the corruption too systematic. He needed another approach. A call to an old friend at the FBI's Civil Rights Division confirmed his suspicions. This case needed federal intervention. The pattern of rights violations and coordinated cover-ups elevated it beyond local jurisdiction. "Once I submit this," he told Sarah, "there's no going back. They'll come after my badge, maybe worse." Sarah picked up a photo of Clara from his desk. "Your mother didn't raise you to look the other way." "Neither did I." Anthony worked through the night, organizing evidence for both federal investigators and select journalists he trusted. He encrypted files, made multiple copies, and prepared secure channels for whistleblowers to come forward. By dawn, he had 2 packages ready, one for the FBI field office, another for a veteran investigative reporter. He also drafted his own statement, knowing he'd soon face accusations of betraying his department. "The real betrayal," he wrote, "is remaining silent while those sworn to protect and serve abuse their power. Every officer who stands by while rights are violated, who covers up misconduct, who chooses loyalty to corrupt colleagues over duty to the public, betrays their badge." The morning sun was rising as he finished. In a few hours, he would detonate a bomb under the department's foundations. But looking at his mother's photo, he knew there was no other choice. Some systems needed to be broken to be rebuilt. The city park filled with thousands by mid-morning, a sea of people carrying signs and wearing t-shirts bearing Clara's image. What began as a community protest had evolved into a regional demonstration, drawing supporters from neighboring states. Civil rights organizations, religious groups, and student activists united under banners demanding police accountability. Clara sat in a wheelchair near the makeshift stage, her physical presence still affected by the attack but her spirit undiminished. She insisted on standing when it was her time to speak, gripping the podium with determined hands. "I've stood before crowds like this for over 50 years, she began, her voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "In 1963, we demanded basic human dignity. In 1968, we mourned Dr. King and promised to carry on his dream. Today, we stand here because that dream remains unfulfilled." The crowd listened intently as she continued, "But this isn't just about what happened to me. Every person here carries a story of injustice, of moments when those meant to protect us became sources of fear. We're here because silence is no longer an option." From the periphery, police units monitored the gathering. Most kept a respectful distance, aware of the optics. But Officer Davidson arrived uninvited, parking his patrol car prominently at the park's entrance. He stood with a deliberate casualness, watching the proceedings with a smirk that carried decades of institutional arrogance. "Look who's still here," Davidson called out loudly enough for nearby protesters to hear. "Thought you'd have gotten the message by now, Mrs. Thompson. This neighborhood's changing." Time for you to find somewhere more suitable. The crowd's reaction was immediate, phones raised to record, bodies moving to shield Clara, voices rising in anger. But Clara raised her hand, silencing them. Officer Davidson, she addressed him directly, her voice steady. You represent everything we're here to change. Your badge doesn't make you superior. Your weapon doesn't make you right. And your hatred doesn't make you strong. Davidson's face reddened. He stepped forward, hand resting deliberately on his holster. Is that a threat, ma'am? No, Officer Davidson, Clara responded, standing straighter. It's a promise. We will not move. We will not be silent. And we will not let fear rule our streets anymore. The crowd erupted in support, chanting, "We won't move." The message echoed across the park, picked up by more voices until it became a thunderous declaration of resistance. Davidson's backup arrived, other officers from his tight-knit group, but they found themselves surrounded by cameras and witnesses. Every move they made was being live-streamed, every word recorded. The power dynamic had shifted. Clara continued speaking, her voice gaining strength. To those who wear the badge honorably, we are not your enemy. We're fighting for a system where you can serve with integrity, where doing right doesn't mean facing retaliation. But to those who abuse their power, your time is ending. The protest transformed into a celebration of community solidarity. Speakers followed Clara, sharing testimonies of survival and resistance. Young activists led chants that bridged generational divides. What Davidson intended as intimidation became a catalyst for unity. As the sun began to set, Clara looked out over the crowd, black, white, brown, young, old, all standing together. She saw in their faces the same determination she'd witnessed in countless movements before. Change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Davidson and his supporters eventually retreated, but not before Clara's final words reached them: "You can't stop what's coming. Justice doesn't sleep forever, and its awakening is here." Anthony met with the journalists in a quiet diner 50 miles outside of Maple Grove, choosing neutral territory for what would become a pivotal meeting. 3 reporters sat across from him, veterans from different publications known for their investigative integrity. "Everything I'm about to share is documented," Anthony began, sliding USB drives across the table. Bodycam footage, internal communications, witness statements, and financial records showing how the corruption works. The eldest reporter, Martinez from the State Tribune, reviewed the files on her laptop. Her eyes widened at the scope of evidence. "This goes beyond Davidson," she noted. "Davidson is just a symptom," Anthony confirmed. "The real story is the system protecting officers like him. Look at the pattern of transfers and promotions. Officers who report misconduct get relegated to desk duty or dangerous assignments. Those who play along get fast-tracked. The evidence revealed a sophisticated network of protection. Officers coordinated their stories after incidents, warning each other about body camera activation, and systematically intimidated witnesses. More disturbing were the financial trails, unexplained deposits in certain officers' accounts following dismissed complaints. Your career is over once this breaks, warned Chen from the Digital Herald. The blue wall doesn't forgive whistleblowers. Anthony nodded. I knew that when I took this job. My mother taught me that sometimes doing right means sacrificing everything. Back at the department, the atmosphere had grown increasingly hostile. Officers who once greeted Anthony warmly now avoided eye contact. His parking spot had been vandalized twice. Anonymous threats appeared in his inbox regularly. Lieutenant Santos, once a trusted colleague, confronted him in the hallway. You're throwing us all under the bus, he hissed. Everything we've built, the respect we've earned, you're destroying it all. The respect was a lie if it was built on covering up abuse, Anthony responded calmly, noting how other officers gathered to watch the confrontation. Word of Anthony's meeting with journalists spread through the department like wildfire. Davidson and his supporters became more brazen in their intimidation attempts. Patrol cars circled Anthony's house at night. His children's school reported suspicious individuals taking photos. Yet support emerged from unexpected quarters. Junior officers, tired of the toxic culture, began coming forward with their own stories. Administrative staff shared records they'd been ordered to alter. Even a retired sergeant contacted Anthony with historical documentation of similar cover-ups. The journalists worked meticulously to verify every detail. They interviewed witnesses, cross-referenced documents, and built an airtight case. The story wasn't just about police brutality, it exposed a deeply rooted system of corruption that had poisoned law enforcement for decades. Once this publishes, there's no going back, Martinez warned during their final meeting. Are you absolutely sure? Anthony thought of his mother, still bearing the marks of Davidson's attack. He thought of every citizen who'd lost faith in the system, every officer forced to choose between conscience and career. Publish it, he confirmed. Every word. The story was scheduled to break simultaneously across multiple platforms, print, digital, and broadcast. Anthony prepared his family for the aftermath, knowing the department's retaliation would be swift and severe. That night, he placed his badge and service weapon on his desk, writing a letter to accompany his formal complaint to the FBI. Tomorrow, the truth would shatter the Blue Wall's foundations, and he would face the consequences of choosing justice over loyalty. The story broke like a tidal wave across all major news outlets. Corruption exposed, police chief reveals systemic abuse dominated headlines. Social media exploded with shared articles and viral clips of body camera footage. Within hours, the governor's office announced an emergency press conference. Public outrage intensified as details emerged. Local news stations ran continuous coverage, featuring interviews with victims who'd previously been silenced. Davidson's history of abuse, once buried in internal files, became public knowledge. Security camera footage from Clara's assault, preserved by vigilant neighbors, played on loop across national networks. The police department scrambled to contain the damage. A hastily called press conference by the police union representative backfired when reporters, armed with Anthony's evidence, challenged every defensive statement. The deputy commissioner's attempt to discredit Anthony as emotionally compromised fell apart when confronted with documented proof of his own involvement in cover-ups. Clara chose this moment to give her first full television interview since the attack. From her living room, still bearing visible scars, she faced the cameras with dignified determination. "My son," she began, her voice steady, "did what every officer should do. He chose truth over comfort, justice over brotherhood. The real question isn't why he exposed this corruption, but why it took so long for someone to stand up." The interview turned the narrative from a simple police scandal to a deeper examination of systemic racism and institutional accountability. Clara's eloquent combination of personal experience and historical perspective resonated across demographic lines. "I've seen this before," she continued. "In the 60s, they said we were troublemakers for demanding basic rights. Today, they call my son a traitor for demanding basic honesty. But truth has a way of prevailing." Pressure mounted on city officials. The mayor, initially hesitant to take sides, faced growing demands for action. Civil rights organizations filed class action lawsuits. The FBI confirmed an ongoing investigation into civil rights violations and corruption. Davidson, feeling the walls closing in, made a crucial mistake. He attempted to hold his own press conference, but his arrogance showed through. When questioned about Clara's assault, he became defensive and combative, his true nature emerging before the cameras. "You people don't understand what we deal with," he snapped at a reporter. "Sometimes you have to show them their place." The racial undertone of his statement wasn't lost on viewers. His own words confirmed everything Anthony's evidence had suggested about the department's culture. Inside the department, the unity of silence began cracking. Officers not implicated in the corruption started distancing themselves from Davidson's group. Some came forward with additional evidence, hoping to save their own careers. Anthony, though suspended pending investigation, found his inbox filling with messages of support from officers across the country. His actions had sparked similar investigations in other departments, encouraging more whistleblowers to come forward. Clara's support group evolved into a formal organization advocating for police reform. They organized peaceful demonstrations outside City Hall, their numbers growing daily. The public's attention remained focused, refusing to let the story fade from headlines. "This isn't just about punishing bad officers," Clara explained in a follow-up interview. "It's about changing a system that protects them. My son risked everything because he believes in what law enforcement should be. Now it's up to all of us to ensure that sacrifice means something." The momentum for change became unstoppable. What began with one act of violence against an elderly woman had exposed decades of institutional corruption, and the public demanded more than just token reforms. The federal courthouse buzzed with tension on the morning of Davidson's hearing. Security was tight, with FBI agents supplementing local law enforcement. The gallery filled early, community members, press, and police officers representing both sides of the divide. Clara sat in the front row, Anthony beside her. Her physical wounds had healed, but their presence served as a constant reminder of what sparked this moment. Behind them, rows of citizens who'd come forward with their own stories of abuse waited to testify. Davidson entered with his legal team, his trademark arrogance noticeably diminished. Weeks of public scrutiny and mounting evidence had taken their toll. His once loyal supporters had dwindled to a small group of older officers, themselves under investigation. The prosecution presented a devastating case. Body camera footage. Financial records showing suspicious payments. Text messages revealing coordination of cover-ups. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, creating an undeniable pattern of abuse and corruption. The turning point came when Officer James Sullivan, Davidson's former partner, approached the witness stand. A 20-year veteran, Sullivan had been part of the old guard. His decision to testify sent shockwaves through the department. "I can't stay silent anymore," Sullivan began, his voice thick with emotion. "What we did, what I helped cover up, it wasn't protecting and serving. It was abuse of power, plain and simple." Sullivan detailed years of systematic racism, excessive force, and corruption. He described how officers who objected were intimidated or forced out. His testimony corroborated every piece of evidence Anthony had gathered. Davidson's composure cracked. In a moment of blind rage, he lunged toward Anthony, shouting, "You traitor! You destroyed everything we built." Before he could reach Anthony, several officers, including some who had once supported him, moved to restrain him. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The thin blue line had finally chosen justice over misplaced loyalty. The judge's ruling was unequivocal. Davidson was immediately terminated, faced criminal charges, and the department was placed under federal oversight. More importantly, the judge ordered a complete review of all cases involving Davidson and his associates. As the courthouse emptied, Clara was surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. She addressed the gathered crowd, her voice carrying the weight of victory tinged with responsibility. "Today isn't just about one officer or one department," she declared. "It's about setting a new standard. About saying that no badge makes anyone above the law, and no uniform justifies injustice." Anthony, though vindicated, faced a long road ahead. The department needed rebuilding from the ground up. But as he looked at the mix of officers and citizens united in celebration, he saw hope for real change. The story made national headlines: "Justice prevails, police reform movement claims victory." Clara's image became a symbol of resilience, and Anthony's actions a blueprint for police accountability nationwide. In the months that followed, the department underwent a transformation. New oversight committees were established. Training protocols were revamped. Community engagement became a priority rather than an afterthought. Clara continued her activism, but now from a position of triumph rather than tragedy. Her experience sparked a movement that spread beyond Maple Grove, inspiring similar reforms across the country. As mother and son left the courthouse together, Clara smiled at Anthony. "Your father would be proud," she said softly. "You didn't just enforce the law, you made it better." The department's motto, displayed prominently in the renovated headquarters, now read, "To protect, serve, and account." A reminder that justice requires not just courage to act, but courage to change.